For years, a man suffered from an unbearable itch in his nose, something no remedy or treatment could resolve. He thought it was just another unsolvable annoyance. But when doctors finally discovered the cause, it was so shocking it left everyone in disbelief. "Hello?" Greg's voice was steady, though curiosity laced his tone. The other end of the call was silent for a moment before a tentative voice responded. "Mr. Turner? Is this Gregory Turner?" "Yes, this is him," Greg replied, his brow furrowing. "Who's calling?" Another pause followed before the voice returned, firmer but tinged with caution. "This might sound strange, but I'm Dr. Patel from Mount Sinai. I'm calling about your case. Could you come into the clinic as soon as possible? We've reviewed your scans, and there's something we need to discuss in person." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward in his chair, gripping the phone tighter. "Something wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'd prefer to explain everything when you're here," Dr. Patel replied. "It's important we move quickly." Greg's mind raced as he set the phone down after agreeing to come in. What could they have found? He'd been hoping for answers, but now, the urgency in Dr. Patel's voice filled him with unease. Whatever it was, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. His breath hitched slightly as he thought back to that bizarre day that made him go to the hospital. For years, he had lived with a deep, relentless irritation in his right nostril that felt as though something was lodged inside. At first, it was easy to ignore, just a mild annoyance that came and went. But over time, it worsened. The itch would flare up randomly, sharp and maddening, making him rub at his nose until it was red and raw. No over-the-counter medications worked. He even tried nasal sprays, allergy pills, even odd home remedies like steam baths and saltwater rinses. Nothing brought relief. His friends joked about it, calling him the nose guy because of how often he rubbed his face or sniffled. But to Greg, it wasn't funny. The itch consumed his thoughts, disrupting his sleep and focus. He spent nights scrolling through online forums, reading about rare nasal conditions, hoping to find a clue. Every post he read led him deeper into a spiral of self-diagnosis, ranging from harmless sinus issues to far more concerning possibilities. One evening, Greg sat in his living room attempting to relax after a long day at work. He had just settled on the couch with a plate of takeout when the itch flared up with a vengeance. It wasn't just the usual nagging sensation. This time it felt sharper, almost as if something were scratching the inside of his nose. He dropped his fork, his hand flying to his face as he rubbed at his nostril furiously, trying to ease the discomfort. But no matter how much he pressed or prodded, the itch didn't relent. Frustrated, he headed to the bathroom mirror, tilting his head back and shining the flashlight from his phone into his nose. Maybe there was something lodged in there, he thought. But all he saw was the same swollen redness that had become familiar after years of irritation. He tried rinsing his nostrils with a saline spray, a routine he had done countless times before. As he leaned over the sink, forcing the solution through his nose, the itching only grew worse, now accompanied by a faint, stinging pain. Greg gripped the edge of the sink, staring at his reflection, his nose running and his patience at its limit. That night, he barely slept. Every time he drifted off, the sensation would jolt him awake. By dawn, he had made up his mind. Enough was enough. Whatever it was, he needed answers. He picked up his phone, searched for specialists in his area, and booked the first available appointment at Mount Sinai. He couldn't live like this anymore. The morning he arrived at Mount Sinai was a typical, bustling day at the clinic. Patients filled the waiting area, flipping through outdated magazines or scrolling on their phones. The receptionist greeted Greg with a polite smile as he checked in, though his unease made it hard to return the gesture. Sitting in the waiting room, he felt a mix of embarrassment and hope. Was he overreacting? Was this just some harmless condition he'd blown out of proportion? When his name was finally called, Greg followed the nurse down a hallway to an examination room. He sat on the edge of the examination table, tapping his fingers nervously as he waited. Moments later, the door opened, and a tall man in a white coat stepped inside, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Turner. I'm Dr. Patel. I'll be taking a closer look at your case today." Greg shook his hand, appreciating the doctor's calm, approachable demeanor. "Thanks for seeing me," he said. Dr. Patel sat down, flipping through Greg's chart with a focused expression. "So it seems you've been dealing with this issue for quite some time now," he said, glancing up. "It also looks like you've seen a few doctors already?" Greg nodded, the frustration evident in his voice. "Yeah, they always say it's allergies or maybe sinus issues. They prescribe sprays or antihistamines, but nothing works. I keep coming back because it's not just an itch. It feels deeper, like something is wrong." Dr. Patel looked up from the chart, his expression thoughtful. "I understand how frustrating that must be. Let's start fresh and take a closer look. Sometimes the answers are where we least expect them." Greg tilted his head back as Dr. Patel began a thorough examination of his nose. Unlike previous doctors, this one seemed methodical, taking his time and inspecting every detail. "You do have a deviated septum and some calcified spurs," the doctor noted, his gloved hand gently repositioning the light for a better view. "But nothing here explains the level of discomfort you're describing." Greg sighed. "That's what everyone says. They look, they find nothing, and I'm back to square one." Dr. Patel straightened, a thoughtful frown crossing his face. "Sometimes the usual methods don't give us the whole picture. Let's do a rhinoscopy. It's a little more invasive, but it will allow us to see deeper into your nasal cavity." Greg hesitated but nodded. "If it gets me closer to figuring this out, I'm all for it." The rhinoscopy was uncomfortable, but Greg endured it, his eyes watering slightly as the camera moved into his nasal passage. Dr. Patel's demeanor shifted as he peered at the monitor. His expression turned from neutral curiosity to focused intensity. "What is it?" Greg asked, his voice tight. Dr. Patel didn't answer right away, adjusting the scope and leaning closer to the screen. Finally, he pulled the camera out and turned to Greg, his voice calm but serious. "I think I see something unusual, something I haven't come across before. I need to order a CT scan to confirm, but this might explain everything." Greg's heart raced. "Unusual how?" "It's too early to say," Dr. Patel replied, "but it's not something we can ignore. Let's get the imaging done and we'll know more soon." Greg's stomach churned with a mix of dread and hope as he headed to the imaging department. This time felt different. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally close to finding out what had been tormenting him for so long. And now, just days after that scan, the phone call he'd been anxiously waiting for had come. The urgency in the doctor's voice replayed in his mind as he grabbed his keys and headed for the clinic. Whatever they had found, it was finally time for answers. The drive to Mount Sinai felt longer than usual, each red light stretching his anticipation to its limit. Greg parked hastily and walked into the clinic, his heart pounding with each step. As he approached the receptionist, she gave him a knowing nod. "Dr. Patel will see you shortly," she said, directing him to the same examination room as before. Greg sat down, bouncing his knee anxiously, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Minutes felt like hours before the door finally opened, and Dr. Patel stepped in, holding a folder. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that immediately caught Greg's attention. "Mr. Turner, thank you for coming in so quickly," Dr. Patel began, taking a seat across from him. He opened the folder and pulled out a few images from the CT scan. "I want to start by saying that what we found is unusual, but it's also something we can address." Greg leaned forward, his throat dry. What did you find?" Dr. Patel laid one of the images on the desk and pointed to a small, distinct object in Greg's nasal cavity. "You have an ectopic tooth," he said. Greg blinked, staring at the image, the words not fully sinking in. "A what?" "An ectopic tooth," Dr. Patel repeated. "It's a rare condition where a tooth develops outside the normal dental area. In your case, it grew in your nasal cavity, likely causing the irritation and discomfort you've been experiencing for years." Greg sat back, his mind reeling. "A tooth? In my nose?" Dr. Patel nodded. "I know it sounds strange, but it's more common than you'd think. It explains your symptoms perfectly. The good news is that it can be removed through surgery." Greg let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "A tooth? I've been suffering all these years because of a tooth in my nose?" Dr. Patel smiled faintly. "Sometimes the human body surprises us in the most unexpected ways. We'll schedule the surgery as soon as possible to remove it. It's a relatively straightforward procedure, and once it's out, your symptoms should resolve completely." For the first time in years, Greg felt a glimmer of hope. The answer was bizarre, almost unbelievable, but it was an answer. And now, there was finally a way forward. The days leading up to the surgery were a mix of relief and disbelief for Greg. He told a few close friends and family about the diagnosis, and their reactions ranged from laughter to shock. "A tooth? In your nose?" his friend Jake exclaimed over the phone. "You've got to be kidding me. That's the most insane thing I've ever heard." "I wish I were," Greg replied, rubbing his forehead, "but at least I finally know what's been causing all this." Jake chuckled. "Man, you should write a book about this. The tooth that took over my life. I'd buy a copy." Greg couldn't help but laugh, but as the conversation ended and the day of the surgery crept closer, his humor gave way to doubt. Late one evening, as he sat on his couch, the reality of it all sank in. What if something went wrong? It seemed so simple, just removing a tooth. But wasn't anything involving surgery inherently risky? He grabbed his phone and searched for complications after nasal surgery, the results filling the screen with worst-case scenarios. He quickly closed the browser, feeling his chest tighten. Jake's words from their earlier call echoed in his mind, pulling him back. "You've suffered with this for years. You finally got an answer." Greg inhaled deeply, forcing himself to focus. The itch had dominated his life for far too long. Whatever fears he had about the surgery, they couldn't outweigh the possibility of finally being free. On the morning of the surgery, Greg arrived at Mount Sinai feeling equal parts nervous and eager. The nurses prepped him quickly, their calm efficiency helping to ease some of his anxiety. As he lay on the operating table, Dr. Patel appeared beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "Ready to get rid of that troublemaker?" the doctor asked, his tone light but steady. "More than ready," Greg replied, forcing a small smile. The anesthesiologist adjusted the mask over Greg's face, and within moments, the world around him faded into darkness. When he woke up, groggy but aware, the first thing he noticed was the absence of the itch. The relentless irritation that had dominated his life for years was gone. It felt surreal, almost like waking from a bad dream. Dr. Patel appeared by his bedside, holding a small container in his gloved hands. Inside was the tiny white culprit, the tooth that had tormented Greg for so long. "Here it is," the doctor said with a grin. "The cause of all your misery." Greg stared at the container, a mix of disgust and fascination washing over him. "That little thing caused all of this?" Dr. Patel nodded. "It's incredible how something so small can have such a huge impact. The surgery went perfectly, and there were no complications. You should feel a significant difference almost immediately." Over the next few days, Greg's recovery was smooth. He marveled at how much better he felt, breathing freely through his nose for the first time in years. The absence of the itch was almost jarring. He hadn't realized how much space it had occupied in his life until it was gone. At his follow-up appointment 3 weeks later, Dr. Patel confirmed that everything had healed beautifully. "You're in the clear," the doctor said with a smile. "How does it feel to be itch-free?" Greg grinned. "Like I've got my life back. I can't thank you enough." That evening, Greg shared the story with friends over dinner, earning gasps and laughter as he recounted the bizarre ordeal. "You're like a walking Ripley's Believe It or Not," Jake joked, raising his glass. Greg laughed, clinking his glass with Jake's. "Here's to finally breathing easy." That night, after the dinner had wrapped up and Greg was back home, he sat on his couch reflecting on the bizarre journey he'd been through. As he leaned back, a faint, sharp twinge flickered inside his nose. It wasn't the maddening itch that had haunted him for years, but a subtle discomfort that caught him off guard. He froze, instinctively touching the bridge of his nose. Was this normal? Was something wrong again? As if on cue, his phone buzzed. Seeing Dr. Patel's name on the screen, Greg's stomach tightened. A late-night call from his doctor wasn't exactly reassuring. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Turner, I'm sorry for calling at this hour," Dr. Patel began, his tone calm but serious. "I hope I didn't disturb you." Greg's heart thudded in his chest. "No, it's fine. Doctor, actually, I'm glad you called. I've been feeling, well, not exactly pain, but a slight twinge in my nose tonight. Is that normal?" There was a reassuring chuckle on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mr. Turner. That's completely normal. You're still in the healing phase, and minor sensations like that are just part of the process. As long as there's no severe pain, swelling, or discharge, you have nothing to worry about." Greg felt the tension in his chest ease. "Good to know. Thanks for clearing that up." Dr. Patel hesitated for a moment before continuing. "And while I have you on the line, I wanted to ask your permission for something. Your case is one of the most unique I've encountered, and I believe documenting it could benefit others. I'd like to include it in a research paper I'm working on. Your identity would remain completely anonymous, but your story could help other doctors recognize and treat similar conditions." Greg hesitated, the idea catching him off guard. "You really think my story could make that much of a difference?" "I do," Dr. Patel said warmly. "Cases like yours are incredibly rare, and your experience might lead to earlier diagnoses for others. It's a chance to turn something frustrating into something meaningful." Greg thought about the years of misery. The sleepless nights, the endless searching for answers. The idea that his ordeal could help someone else avoid all of that made him smile. "You have my permission, Doc. If it helps even one person, it's worth it." "Thank you, Mr. Turner," Dr. Patel said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And remember, if you have any concerns during your recovery, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here to help." As the call ended, Greg set the phone down and leaned back into the couch, touching the bridge of his nose once more. The twinge had already faded, and with it, so had his worry. He smiled to himself, thinking of how far he had come. For the first time in years, Greg felt truly at peace. What had once been an unsolvable mystery was now just a strange chapter in his life, a story to tell, and a reminder of how even the most bizarre problems can have a solution. What an incredible journey! What would you do if a strange medical condition turned your life upside down, and then finally got resolved in the most unexpected way? How would you handle it? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more unbelievable stories like this one. See you in the next video.